Every whisper between us feels like a secret the world isn't allowed to hear. But some secrets are impossible to keep. The library had always been his refuge. For the young man, barely 25, it was a place of quiet thought, of pages rustling softly under his fingers, and the faint musky scent of old books that somehow felt comforting. He came often, telling himself it was for research, for his studies, but a small, unspoken reason drew him back even more: her. She was the librarian, poised and graceful in her early 40s, moving among the shelves with a quiet authority tempered by an almost imperceptible warmth. He had noticed her before, how her hair caught the soft lamplight, how the corners of her mouth lifted just slightly when she smiled at a student or whispered instructions. There was something calming yet intriguing in her presence, as though the world outside the library ceased to exist when she was near. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the spark first ignited. He had found a secluded corner to read, poring over a dense book on history, whispering notes to himself in the silence. His voice was barely audible, a simple musing over a passage. And then, unexpectedly, a soft whisper floated back, his name. He froze, heart skipping. He hadn't expected anyone to hear him, yet there she was, leaning slightly from the nearby shelf, eyes twinkling behind her glasses. The air between them felt suddenly charged. She handed him another book, her fingers brushing his hand for a fleeting second. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it left a warmth trailing through him, lingering in his chest long after the touch ended. For a moment he allowed himself to observe her, the gentle way she tilted her head, the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the must of old pages, the rhythm of her breath as she leaned closer to place the book on his table. It was intimate in a way that was entirely innocent, yet his mind betrayed him, filling the space between them with possibilities that made his pulse quicken. Their conversation remained simple and polite, a quiet exchange about the book he was reading. But in that soft-spoken dialogue, every word seemed to carry double meaning. Every glance, every barely their brush of her fingers, felt like a conversation in itself. It was as if the library, with its hushed ceilings and warm, amber light, had created a world just for the two of them, a world where whispers mattered more than shouts, where subtlety held a kind of magic he couldn't resist. As he left that afternoon, the memory of her whisper lingered like a secret melody. He found himself replaying it, feeling a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. She had not even known the power of that single, fleeting moment, yet it had shifted something inside him. He wanted to return, not just for the books, but for the unspoken connection, for the quiet thrill of being noticed by her, even in the smallest way. The first spark had been lit, invisible yet unmistakable, and neither of them could ignore it. After that first whispered exchange, the library felt different. Every visit carried a subtle tension, a quiet electricity that seemed to hum in the spaces between the shelves. He found himself arriving earlier, lingering longer, telling himself it was for the books, for research, but really it was for her. The librarian moved through the library with her usual graceful ease, but now he noticed the little details that he had missed before. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the faint smile that appeared when a student found exactly what they were looking for, the soft way her fingertips traced the edges of the books she handled. And once, when he thought she wasn't looking, he caught her gaze lingering on him, a subtle tilt of her head that made his chest tighten with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. He began to study her habits quietly, observing the rhythm of her day. The way she paused over certain books longer than necessary, the way she whispered instructions to students in a tone that was both gentle and commanding, the quiet hum of her presence that seemed to fill the room without her needing to speak. Sometimes, he would see her glance in his direction, quickly darting her eyes away when he met them, but those brief encounters left him breathless. Each look carried weight, a silent question that neither of them dared to voice. And then, inevitably, it happened again. He reached for a book on the upper shelf, straining slightly, and her hand appeared beside his, steadying the volume. Their fingers brushed, barely, almost imperceptibly, but enough to send a shiver of warmth through him. He glanced at her, meeting her eyes, and for a long moment either spoke. The library seemed to grow quieter, the soft hum of distant pages fading into the background. The brush of her skin against his lingered longer than it should have, and he felt an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. This was no ordinary interaction. He caught himself thinking about her outside the library, wondering what she might be doing, whether she thought of him in the same way. Each glance, each whispered word from before replayed in his mind, growing in intensity. He noticed that his heart seemed to recognize her presence before his mind did, quickening at her steps, settling when her attention returned to him. She began to develop small habits around him that he couldn't ignore. The gentle lowering of her voice when speaking to him, the occasional brush of her hand against his arm when guiding him to a book, the way she smiled just slightly more warmly when he asked questions. These moments were fleeting but charged, like sparks in the hush of the library, leaving him longing for more. By the end of his visit, he realized he was no longer coming just for the books. Every glance, every whisper, every almost touch had woven a quiet tension that neither of them could deny. He left the library feeling a strange mixture of exhilaration and vulnerability, knowing that something significant had begun, delicate and unspoken, yet undeniably present. The game of lingering glances had begun, and with it, the slow, irresistible pull of their hearts toward each other. The tension between them had grown into something unspoken yet unmistakable. Each visit to the library now carried a quiet expectation, a sense that the air itself held its breath whenever they were near. It was subtle, delicate, and entirely intoxicating. One rainy afternoon, the young man found himself lingering near the fiction section, pretending to browse, though his mind was only half on the books. She appeared quietly from the next aisle, her hair slightly damp from the drizzle, the edges of her scarf curling around her neck. She smiled at him, a small, knowing curve of her lips, and for a moment, the world beyond the library ceased to exist. "Looking for anything in particular?" she whispered, her voice soft, playful, teasing just enough to make him catch his breath. He shook his head, smiling shyly. "Just wondering." She tilted her head, her eyes glinting with amusement. "Wandering can be dangerous in a place full of stories," she whispered back, brushing her fingers against the spine of a book as she passed it to him. Their fingers met briefly, the contact lingering longer than strictly necessary, leaving a warmth that seemed to pulse through him. From that moment, a quiet game began. He would whisper a title, a random line from a book, or even a joke to himself, and she would answer in kind, her soft voice carrying just enough melody to make him pause and listen. Their words were innocent, yet each exchange felt loaded with subtle meaning, a private conversation carried out in hushed tones among the shelves. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they delivered them. The brush of a hand when passing a book, the slight lean closer when she whispered an aside, the tilt of her head that made her smile seem like a secret meant only for him. He found himself anticipating these moments, feeling a rush of warmth and excitement each time she spoke his name softly. One afternoon, as he leaned over a book, she knelt beside him to point something out, her hair brushing against his shoulder. The sensation was fleeting but electric, a touch that lingered in his thoughts long after she had straightened and stepped back. Their eyes met, holding just a little longer than necessary, and for a heartbeat, it felt as though the library itself had contracted, making room only for them. He realized that he was no longer simply admiring her. He was attuned to her in a way that felt almost instinctual. The way she whispered, the way she moved, the way she let her voice lower just for him, it was all a kind of intimacy, quiet but profound. Each playful whisper became a promise, a subtle acknowledgement that neither of them wanted to break. By the time he left that day, his mind was alight with the memory of her voice, her touch, the quiet game they had created. The library, once just a place for books, had transformed into a space charged with possibility, a place where whispers could speak louder than words, and every fleeting glance or brush of skin carried the promise of something deeper yet to come. The slow dance of their hearts had begun, and neither of them wanted to step away. The young man walked home from the library that evening with a swirl of thoughts he couldn't quite control. Each whispered word, each fleeting brush of her hand, had left a mark on him, warm and insistent, yet he couldn't ignore the hesitations creeping into his mind. She was older, experienced, poised in ways he admired but also feared. Could a connection like this ever feel right in the world beyond the library walls? He remembered how her eyes lingered on him sometimes, a softness that made his chest ache and his pulse quicken. But there was also a careful restraint in her gestures, a subtle boundary he knew he couldn't cross too eagerly. The awareness of their age difference, of the quiet social expectations surrounding them, weighed on him, even as his heart leapt every time she whispered his name or brushed her fingers against his. Meanwhile, she too felt the pull of their growing closeness. She noticed how he watched her, not in a crude or disrespectful way, but with a kind of careful attentiveness that made her heart flutter. His earnestness, the way he spoke softly, the way his eyes followed her movements across the shelves, it was endearing, magnetic even, but she couldn't ignore the whisper of caution that threaded through her mind. The age gap, the difference in life experience, the quiet knowledge that this attraction could complicate more than it fulfilled, all of it lingered between them. Their moments together became a delicate dance. She would lean slightly closer to him, while handing over a book, just enough that he felt the warmth of her hand brushing his, then step back before the contact became too intimate. He would catch himself watching her from across the aisle, noticing the subtle changes in her expression when he smiled or whispered a joke under his breath. Both of them were acutely aware of the unspoken tension, each gesture laden with meaning, each glance carrying more weight than the words themselves. Sometimes, he would replay their interactions in his mind, questioning whether he was imagining the intensity, wondering if she felt the same undercurrent of desire and hesitation that he did. His emotions were a mix of excitement and guilt, longing and restraint. And she, in turn, would feel a flutter of longing when he laughed softly at one of her whispered comments, followed by a pang of apprehension at how deeply this connection was already settling into her heart. The library itself seemed to reflect their conflicted awareness. Its hushed corridors and warm lamplight provided safety, a controlled space where they could explore the closeness without the outside world intruding. Each whispered conversation became a test of restraint, each accidental touch a spark that neither could fully suppress nor fully indulge. By the end of the day, both of them carried a quiet ache of unspoken emotions. They were drawn to each other, undeniably, yet cautious in ways that made every interaction feel simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. The tension between them had evolved from curiosity to desire, tempered by respect, hesitation, and a shared understanding of the delicate boundaries they could not yet cross. In that fragile balance of longing and restraint, the story of their slow-burn connection deepened, intimate, human, and quietly irresistible. It was late afternoon when the library had finally emptied, leaving only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint rustle of pages in the background. The young man lingered near the history section, pretending to search for a book, but in truth, he was aware of every movement she made. She moved with her usual grace, placing returned volumes back on the shelves, occasionally pausing to adjust a book's spine, her hair catching the golden light filtering through the tall windows. He realized then that these quiet moments when the library was theirs alone, were charged with something neither of them had yet admitted. She turned toward him, eyes meeting his briefly, and in that instant, the room seemed to shrink. The distance between them was small, but it carried weight, anticipation, and an unspoken invitation. "Are you still reading that series?" she whispered, stepping closer. Her voice was soft, yet each word felt deliberate, a personal thread woven into the hush of the library. He nodded, feeling his chest tighten. "Yes, it's surprisingly engaging." He tried to sound casual, but the warmth in his voice betrayed him. She knelt slightly to point at a passage in the book he held, and their hands brushed as she guided him. The contact was light, fleeting, yet the sensation lingered far longer than necessary. He became acutely aware of the texture of her sleeve against his skin, the subtle warmth radiating from her hand. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended, the library no longer just a place for books, but a world that existed solely for the two of them. "What do you think?" she asked softly, her head tilting just enough for her hair to sweep near his shoulder. Her proximity made the air between them feel electric, yet safe, intimate without crossing boundaries. He swallowed hard, feeling the need to speak, to bridge the quiet tension. I think it's beautiful. And it makes me think differently about things." His words were honest, carrying more than just his opinion on the text. They carried his curiosity, his vulnerability, his growing admiration for her. She smiled, a fleeting, gentle curve of her lips that made him catch his breath. "I'm glad," she whispered, her eyes lingering on his face with an intensity that sent a warm shiver through him. "I like hearing your perspective." For a few moments, they simply existed in that quiet space together, whispering observations and small jokes about the books they both loved. Each exchange carried a subtle intimacy, soft laughter, gentle touches, the shared rhythm of breath and whispered words. Their hearts seemed to align in the stillness, creating a private language that existed beyond words, beyond the library walls. When she finally stood to leave, he felt a pang of longing, a silent wish for the moment to stretch on indefinitely. She gave him a small, knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond that had grown stronger in these shared minutes. And as he watched her move back toward the desk, he realized that what had begun as curiosity and fleeting attraction had evolved into something far more profound, a quiet, tender intimacy that neither of them wanted to ignore. The library, empty and still, held their whispers, their touches, and their growing connection. And in that charged silence, both of them understood that the slow burn of their hearts had moved into a new, undeniable territory, closeness, trust, and the first brush of true emotional intimacy. The library had taken on a different hue that evening. The golden light from the tall windows had softened into a gentle amber, casting long shadows across the rows of books. The young man lingered near the history shelves, aware that this would be one of the last moments before the library emptied completely. And then she appeared, her movements quiet, fluid, yet deliberate, as if she, too, felt the weight of the unspoken tension that had grown between them. She approached, carrying a small stack of returned books. Their eyes met, and in that simple glance, a question passed silently between them, one neither of them dared to speak aloud. She knelt to place the books on a lower shelf, her hair brushing lightly against his shoulder, and for a moment, the air seemed to thrum with electricity. "You've been here a lot lately," she whispered, her voice low, warm, almost playful, but with a softness that made his chest tighten. I enjoy the quiet," he replied, meeting her gaze steadily. But in truth, it was more than the quiet he craved. It was her presence, the subtle warmth she brought into the space around her, the rhythm of her breath, and the gentle way her hand had brushed his only moments before. She leaned a fraction closer, so close that the warmth of her body brushed his side. Her voice dropped even lower. "You know, sometimes, when you speak softly, I find myself whispering your name in return." His heartbeat accelerated. The words, soft and intimate, carried more meaning than she could possibly intend, or maybe she intended all of it. Without thinking, he leaned slightly closer, lowering his own voice to a whisper. "Then, I'll whisper yours back." For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them. Then, as if the world itself had paused, their hands brushed while reaching for the same book. The touch lingered, just enough for warmth to flow from her fingers into his. Their eyes met, and in that quiet gaze, an unspoken acknowledgement bloomed, desire, respect, and an undeniable connection that neither could deny. She smiled softly, a blush just perceptible on her cheeks, and whispered, almost teasingly. "Careful, the library isn't supposed to be this intimate." He smiled back, whispering a single word in return. "I don't mind." It wasn't just flirtation, it was a confession in the most delicate, careful way, a recognition of their feelings without needing overt words. The room seemed to shrink around them, the shelves of books forming walls that held their secret world. Every whispered word, every gentle brush of fingers, every lingering glance was a bridge across the divide of hesitation, fear, and social expectation. They remained there for several minutes, sharing soft whispers, small touches, and quiet laughter, each interaction deepening the bond between them. Neither wanted to step back, yet both understood the power of restraint, the intimacy of a connection that could grow slowly and deliberately. As the evening drew to a close, they parted with a lingering glance, their hearts heavy with longing yet light with the knowledge that the unspoken had now been acknowledged. The confession through whisper had shifted everything, transforming curiosity and tension into something tender, thrilling, and profoundly intimate. The library had settled into an almost magical calm. Evening light filtered softly through the tall windows, casting a warm glow across the wooden shelves and polished floors. The young man entered, his footsteps quiet against the carpeted aisles, and he immediately felt the familiar pull of anticipation. He knew she would be there, as always, moving through the books with her poised grace, yet now the air between them carried a new, undeniable intimacy. She looked up and smiled the moment she saw him, the gentle curve of her lips lighting up her eyes. There was no need for words. After their whispered confessions, the space between them was already rich with understanding and warmth. She gestured to a seat near the poetry section, and he followed, settling beside her. They spoke softly, voices low, sharing thoughts about the books they loved, letting the conversation drift into personal stories. He told her about a memory from his childhood, something he rarely shared, and she listened with quiet attention, her eyes gentle and her hand brushing against his arm in a gesture of comfort. He felt a surge of connection, the steady warmth of her presence grounding him in a way that nothing else could. At one point, she leaned slightly closer, their shoulders touching, and he felt the reassuring weight of her closeness. Their fingers brushed as she handed him a book, and this time, neither of them recoiled. Instead, they allowed the contact to linger, fingers intertwining subtly, naturally, as if it had always been meant to be. The whispered conversations continued, light laughter mingling with the quiet ambience of the library, each word carrying a gentle intimacy that spoke louder than any declaration. She rested her hand briefly on his shoulder, her touch warm and grounding, and he felt a quiet courage swell within him. He looked at her, seeing not just the confident, graceful librarian he had admired from afar, but the tender, vulnerable woman who had allowed herself to share this slow-burn connection with him. His heart swelled with affection and gratitude for her trust and presence. When it was finally time to leave, they lingered near the doorway, not wanting to break the spell of the evening. She rested her head lightly on his shoulder, and he could feel her breath against his chest, the soft rhythm of her heartbeats synchronizing with his own. Their whispers had evolved into a shared silence that carried more meaning than words ever could. Outside, the world was dimming into twilight, but the warmth of their connection remained vibrant, luminous, and real. Hand in hand, they walked slowly down the quiet street, laughter and whispered exchanges blending with the evening breeze. The age gap, once a source of hesitation, now felt like a bridge between their experiences, a shared space where mutual respect, care, and affection could flourish naturally. By the end of the evening, the tension and uncertainty that had threaded through their encounters had transformed into a gentle, steady intimacy. The whispered names, the lingering touches, the soft glances, they had become a language of their own, a testament to a bond nurtured patiently and tenderly. In that warm, quiet satisfaction, both of them understood that the slow-burn romance they had built was not just fleeting, it was enduring, deeply human, and entirely theirs. The story closed on a moment of quiet contentment, hearts aligned, and whispers shared in the safe intimacy of both the library and their own tenderly woven connection.